I thank God for today. That's it, Father. Bryan has good voice. I don't know what happened with the microphone, but we had to shut it off anyway. And today we're focusing on Padre Pio. And remember, the overall theme of our program is that God desires us to so live that not merely will we go to heaven the moment we die, but that we will be able to bring blessing from heaven. And if you want the proof of somebody being able to bring blessing from heaven, Padre Pio is certainly proof of it. There are different levels to heaven that some people don't realize. The closer you are to God in this life, the more open you will be to Him the next life, and then the greater the ability to bring blessing from heaven. So today we focus on Padre Pio, and we welcome Father Bryan with his message.
I couldn't help but overhear our friend who prayed for Brother Crowley, for Brother Kevin. I was a very good friend of Kevin's. He was my friend. And I'm quite sad in a sense, but also full of gratitude. My heart is full. If there was ever a fella, and it was actually one of the Carmelites who was at the funeral mass yesterday, Father Dan, who I was with in Beaumont Hospital as chaplain. And Dan said if he doesn't get into heaven, there's no chance for the rest of us. Yeah. And Kevin, I believe, is going to do so much more now. He's going to kick up a lot of dust from heaven with Padre Pio, for example. And to build a bridge between maybe what I'm going to say for these next little while, to build a bridge between that and today's gospel, which we just had there at Holy Mass, this mission of Jesus to appoint 72 others. You see, Padre Pio was only human. Brother Kevin was only human. Peter, the chief of the apostles, was only human. Paul was only human, and we had our feast day recently. All these giants of the spiritual world, Therese, Faustina, Clare of Assisi, Mother Teresa. Somebody said one time there was a great icon painted after Mother Teresa was canonized with Therese of Lisieux, the little flower, Teresa of Avila, Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, Edith Stein, who died in the gas chambers, and Mother Teresa. And one was called, they were all different Teresas. Teresa the Great. And Mother Teresa was known as Tiny Teresa. Tiny but gigantic. Mother Teresa really did put it up to some of these world leaders. I mean, there was a certain American president who used to avoid her because he had no comeback. You are not pro-life. You are not pro-life. You are not protecting the lives of the most defenseless unborn. How can you say you are pro-life when you are not? When you allow this unrestricted abortion and so on. So she was very, very tenacious. And Brother Kevin was someone also who believed in the absolute sanctity of human life from the moment of conception to the moment of natural death. Kevin was not woke. He was not a snowflake. So he was someone who, wasn't afraid to say how he felt about things. I was reading Michael Kelly wrote an obituary today in the Sunday Independent, and he had called me up and asked me for some personal insights about Brother Kevin. But he obviously did his research because he was asking a few people. And one of the things he reminded us of is that apparently somebody in the Dáil, a left-wing politician who was angry with the church at the time, said something like that the church should be consigned to the dustbin of history. And Brother Kevin was asked about that. What's your comment on that? And he said, well, maybe that person should be thrown into the dustbin. So he was fundamentally, Brother Kevin was a religious. He was a brother. He was a Franciscan friar. He was a man of the gospel. He wasn't that sophisticated. But then again, neither were the great disciples sophisticated. Peter, the apostle, was the hot-headed, he'd fly off the handle. Peter was someone also who was kind of, I think a teacher one time in my school used to describe him as any getcher going, Peter would just go for you. Peter was, and he was the most, he was the most kind of indecisive man, Peter. And even though he did deny Jesus 3 times, his heart, his broken heart, couldn't help but come back to Jesus and promise that he loved him. I love you. Feed my lambs. I love you. Look after my sheep, and so on. Paul was another holy terror. St. Stephen's Day, 26th of December, the first martyr of the church that we celebrate. After the joy of Christmas and the gold vestments or the white vestments and the placing of the babe in the manger, and we say the Angelus in honor of the if you like, the incarnation. The following day we celebrate a martyrdom where Stephen was stoned because of his preaching of the word. And the guy who was in charge of the stoning was a guy called Saul. Saul was bent on the destruction of the church, and Jesus said, I'll have him. I'll have his enthusiasm for destruction, and I'll change it and I'll turn it upside down. And Paul became one of the greatest champions of the church. Paul was a Pharisee, a senior Jew. I mean, Paul even kind of gave out to Peter in the scriptures. So these are the two characters who kind of our church is built on, Paul and Peter. Blissfully human. But yet you see, with Christ they did so much. And we could look at all the saints. Did you know that St. Pius X, the great saint of the Eucharist, gave away an awful lot of his meals to the poor? So much so that he hardly had anything to eat. And his sisters gave out more to him. They kept the house. When he was Bishop of Mantua, an Archbishop of Venice, Patriarch of Venice, and then, they said, Bepi they called him. Bepi was his pet name. He was a great cardinal, Bepi. He became a great saint of the Eucharist. He allowed little children to receive their first communion at 7. Bepi, you cannot be doing this. You cannot keep giving this food away. You need your strength. Oh, I had to do it because I was so sad about this poor. So they were kind of scratching their heads. So their hearts were broken with this guy. And so on and so on and so forth. So if you sit there and you feel sinful or you feel, oh God, I don't know, you're in good company. Kevin again was someone who, I wouldn't like to fall out with him. Because he was a driven man. He was driven in his passion for the poor and the broken and those who were homeless. He had some little clothing project going in the end of the 60s. And they were helping the poor with those. They were laundering them, they were giving them out and so on. And he was out the street one morning. He used to go up to the Morning Star sometimes, up to Frank Duff. I said to him, how did you get on with Frank? Oh, he said, we fought like cats. Because Frank Duff was probably a bit like himself, pioneering, driven, man with a plan. And sometimes thoroughbreds don't get on. My dad knew Frank, and my dad's neighbours down the road in Glasnevin, the Crowleys, were founder members of the Legion with Frank. Eileen Topsy and Crowley. And they were great people, these people. They were kind of the first to do things. Well, on his way back he was up to, early in the morning, I'm sure, he saw 2 homeless lads going through a dustbin and eating spoiled food, rancid food, because they were so hungry. He said, this isn't right. This can't be right. So he got some people together, benefactors we call them, and he said, let's try and do something. And it was winter. They were freezing with the cold. So there was an old room at the back of the friary in Church Street, better than a shed, and they took over that, fixed it up a bit, and they started to make hot soup. Boil water for pots of tea, and some people brought in sandwiches and whatnot. And every day after they leave the hostels in the cold, they'd come and they'd be allowed and they'd have the cup of tea and they'd sit in the warm for an hour and have a bowl of soup or a cup of soup and so on. And the day centre grew and morphed over the years to fulfil different needs. In the late 70s and 80s, the real heroin problem and drug problem was the epidemic. In the 90s, again, there was that spillover of the hard drug problem, but also, there were other social needs, particularly when, it was originally a day centre for homeless men, But there were so many women and children homeless, and they needed a place to go. So it started to develop there. They also started to develop, education programs, city and guilds programs. In the 2000s, with the recession, even with the boom in the economy in the 2000s, there were still people who were falling short and below the poverty line, despite the fact that there was money. And then when the economy crashed, Kevin used to talk about the new poor, people who were living in big houses with 2 cars and mortgages, with sort of these, not tracker mortgage, and just couldn't afford it, lost jobs. And he told a story which Pope Francis heard. And this woman who had come in a large car to come and get something from the day centre. Welcome. And she was asking for, the bag of groceries. Every Wednesday they give groceries out to those who are in need. And there's essentials in it: cheese, butter, sliced pan of bread, rashers and sausages, chicken, just basic provisions for a few days. And he said, "Why are you coming here and you're in such a big car?" She says, "I'm homeless." Huh? She said, "This is my home. I'm living in the car." And Kevin kind of started, he told me this, and it obviously he must have told the media. He said, "I'll never ever ask a question again. I'm not going to ask any questions about people's circumstances. People will come because they need to come, and I will accept them where they're at." He told me the same story, on the same day, another woman came looking for basically the makings of a breakfast that her daughter was doing her leaving cert, and she had no food, she had no breakfast. So that was the sort of 2011, 2012 when the bottom fell out of the economy. Then obviously the international visitors started to come in great numbers, and that compounded the situation. But like everything else, the love story, the success story of the day centre, and Kevin would have said this, was the volunteers. The volunteers and the supporters, those who raise money, those who quietly donate for the help. I always remember the government gives €450,000 a year in subvention, and that more or less pays the wages of the staff. But the shortfall, I think it's 3.5 or nearly 4 million per annum, the running costs. So there's a big shortfall, which is made up of voluntary donations, which is the lifeline, which is what only for that ordinary people raising funds, Christmas things, donations, children doing sale of works and so on, golf clubs, doing different things. All of that is how the day centre moves and the machinery moves. But Kevin was such a passionate advocate for the poor and the homeless. He was someone who, I think he personified St. Francis, the little poor man, as we call him. Francis, who saw in everyone an image of God. Francis, who saw in all creation the handiwork of the good Lord. Francis, who himself didn't want to lower himself because he was a lesser brother or a frati minori, a friar minor, the order of friars minor, OFM, you'd know as the words of the Franciscans and Capuchins. But rather raise people up above his station, raise people up in their dignity. And that's what Kevin wanted to do. He wanted to raise the homeless up so much. There's some funny stories. I mean, great stories. I mean, people would donate suits, and a man came in and he found himself homeless, and he had a chance of a job. But of course, you see, if you have no home and no address, that's a problem. So some of the people would be allowed to use 29 Bow Street as their address, which is the day centre's address. 29 Bow Street, Dublin South. And there they could, until they get themselves on their feet, their correspondence and so on would go there. And this guy had found himself homeless, had, by luck, God's grace, he got a job. And he had to go for an interview. And Kevin organised a suit and, got him into the day centre. He had a wash and a shave and a shower, and he got a pair of shoes and things, and he was able to go. Came back and said, "I got the job." And got himself back on the track again. And that man is never done thanking God and thanking Kevin's memory for what Kevin did for him. But there was a millionaire businessman who we know, I won't mention his name, who sent his driver down with a boot full of Louis Copeland suits and donated them to the day centre. And the lads were all there, and you see, the day that they happened to donate them was the day that they put a lot of the clothes out, and people would sort of take a coat or a top or a tracksuit bottoms or something, or a pair of runners before they leave. But when some of the suits were left out, bespoke suits. And long story short, anyway, two of the lads were walking down the quays before the boardwalk, and a Garda car drives up and sees these two fellas, well-known lads, dressed up in Louis Copeland, and pulled in, and one of the guys said, "Oh yeah, so what's your excuse here, boys?" "Well, Brother Kevin gave us these suits." A likely story. No, really. So he knew Kevin, the guy, rang him up and said, "There's two fellas here saying that, they're wearing very good Louis Copeland suits." And he said, "Yeah, we got a donation of Louis Copeland suits this morning. They're actually telling the truth." So that was a great story about it, But it really was like he could shoot from the hip, and he also see there's a danger that you give with no challenge. You can become a kind of what would you call an enabler. Leave them in their cycle. And Kevin was always careful, yes, we will do this. Nobody should go hungry, but let's help them to sort of get on track again. And he was always careful about that. That's why there was other facilities in the day centre, like podiatry, like counselling. Safety Net provided a doctor 3 days a week and a nurse 5 days a week. A retired doctor a retired dentist, from not too far from here, gave his equipment, and they have dentistry. They also have haircuts for homeless, where they can get a good haircut, or women can get a bit of a hairdo, because that makes you feel 1,000% better. So there's all sorts of great facilities there. But he was always saying, let's be real. Get moving as well. Do your best. And this person anyway was looking for a handout, a lad, and he was a bit of a chancer by all accounts. And Kevin said, "Look, you need to get your act together." "What do you mean? I'm in a bad way and I'm homeless and you don't get this." No, he said, "You do." He said, "You need to get your act together. I'm not giving you no more money now. You come around to the centre in the morning and we get you sorted. I'll do this and I'll do that." So he went off down the street, swearing and giving out about Brother Kevin, and Kevin went into the house and he met another Capuchin coming up. "Oh man, he's yakety yak. He's they call him a saint. There's hope for us all." What was wrong? "He won't look after me." I said, "But I tell you what I do. Let me go up and get him. Maybe we see. Did he hear you?" "I'd rather listen. Don't bother. I'd rather talk to the devil himself than talk to him again." And Kevin heard that. He thought it was the funniest thing. I'd rather talk to the devil himself than talk to him again. But anyway, look. He was laid to rest yesterday. He died in his native Cork. He was 3 years down there after he retired from the day centre. He was 90 years of age last February, and he's laid to rest in Dublin. I think that's after the secret of Fatima. That's the other great secret. Is why Kevin wanted to go back to Dublin for his funeral and burial. A proud Cork man, but that's the way it is, And we were all joking that you'd probably be talking to Christy Ring in heaven last evening with divided loyalties, and that maybe the Dubs might have a chance, but it wasn't to be. Cork did a fairly good job on Dublin by all accounts yesterday, so I think Kevin had the last laugh there. But anyway, I'm telling the story about a man who took his vows seriously. I'm telling a story who suffered. Kevin had his first triple bypass, coronary bypass, in the 1970s. And the surgeon who performed the surgery and the second surgery 10 years later, Kevin saw him down. And Kevin had poor health a lot of his life. But it didn't stop him. It didn't stop him blazing a trail. I mean, he was a cancer patient and he had other, problems. mitigating, health problems, physical health problems, which again didn't stop him. He fought a long time, adding a second walking stick, and then eventually a rollator, because he wasn't great on the feet towards the end. And again, like that, this idea that he would always be conscious of his suffering and the sufferings of Jesus. He would always be conscious of, his dependence on the real presence of the Eucharist in adoration. Kevin was up at 4:30 every morning, and he'd be down in the choir, and he'd be praying probably till 6:30 initially, and he'd go over and he'd start up some of the hot plates, and the staff would be coming in, and they'd get the breakfast ready, and Kevin would go back over then at about 7ish, and he'd sit then till our morning prayer and mass at 8. And he'd be back over in the day centre, and he'd be watching his watch from about 12:30, and at 1:50 he'd be over for rosary in common and midday prayer, and then he'd have his dinner with the friars. And we'd often see him in in the choir. He'd be our evening prayer was at 5:45, you see, and lads would go in from evening meditation. We have 2 periods of meditation, half an hour in the morning and half an hour in the evening, so that's an hour of personal prayer. Now most of us would do a lot longer, well, a good bit longer than that, and Kevin would do even more than that. But in the evenings, you'd often see him sitting like this, with the legs crossed. He could fall asleep on a sixpence, and but he was a deeply prayerful man. And he often said to journalists, "If I hadn't my relationship with God, if I hadn't my prayer, I've nothing." So, he ticked all the boxes. He was a man of prayer. He was a friar who was a man of prayer, who took his vows seriously. And the core of the first rule of St. Francis of Assisi is to observe the Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, living without anything of one's own, in poverty, in chastity, and in obedience. He was a man who suffered, who had a stigmata, bad health, all his life. And number 3, he was again a man who helped the poor, who gave his life for the poorest of the poor. And it wasn't sort of something that he wanted, to kind of get brownie points for. It came naturally to him. He felt very passionately about that. He wasn't interested at all in fame. I said, Kevin, I was on the phone. He was on the phone when I went into the city. Colin Keane of RTE, the late Colin Keane, married to Una O'Hagan. They came in because Colin had written some books on Padre Pio, and one of the books had got great profits, and he gave a cheque for 175,000 to the homeless. And so Kevin introduced me to them. We were sitting chatting to Kevin. So I went in another day, and there was Christy Moore was in the day centre, and he wanted to give the proceeds of one of his concerts in Vicar Street to the homeless. And on another day, I wasn't there this day, but one of the lads, President arrived, President Higgins, came up the stairs, and the security lad knocked on Kevin's door. Kevin said, "Yes, Brother Kevin, what?" He was just snowed under. President is here. And Kevin told me this later on. He said, "The president of what?" President Higgins. "Will you get lost?" And with that, Michael D walks in. Oh! And another day when Kevin was in the matter private, he had been ill. In comes President Higgins into the room. They were very good friends. And I was in the sitting room, and Kevin's phone rang, and he took the call. Sometimes he'd look at the number and he'd kind of go, "I spoke to that person already today, I'll get them back." But this time a number came up. It was a landline number. "Hello?" "Oh, yes." "Oh, hello, President. Hello, yes. And so on the conversation went. At the end of it, I said, "Kevin," I said, "do I wouldn't be surprised if you get a state funeral or something like it." "Oh, would you get lost?" he said. "Ah!" And I knew then there was a sting in the tail of what he said. He wasn't interested at all. So, extraordinary man, again, as I said, lived the Franciscan calling, lived the gospel, suffered, and looked after the poor. It reminds me, his life reminds me in some sense of Padre Pio. Padre Pio didn't have heart problems, but he had another kind of stigmata, which of course was covered by a little bandage and the brown fingerless gloves. And the Padre Pio glove, of course, is not magical. I told you this before. There's nothing magical in it. But what it is a stepping stone to the healing Jesus, the healing Christ. And Padre Pio, again, was someone who lived the same rule as Brother Kevin. Or Brother Kevin lived the same rule as Padre Pio. Because both of them lived the rule of St. Francis, which is based on the gospel, or what we call the marrow of the gospel. And Brother Kevin is, Padre Pio, like the stories I told about Brother Kevin, I could tell you stories about friars who knew Padre Pio. And maybe just one little story and I'll finish up then. And it's a story of, I told it last year, so maybe you mightn't remember it, but I think it's worth repeating. But then again, we hear Gospels all the time in the 3-year cycle and on Easter. From Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. So, you know, they come up again. So a story retold sometimes is highly appropriate. But we had a friar called Father Bruno, who was from Kilkeel in County Down and who was a missionary in Zambia. And Bruno, like the African missionaries at that time in the 50s and 60s, used to come home every few years for a few months' holidays, like a home leave. So at the start of the 60s, Pope Paul VI became Pope in 63. Bruno had a chance on his way home with a few of the friars to go to Rome for an audience with the Pope. So it was a great thrill, a great gift. And they all arrived in Rome. They had the audience with the Pope, and they were a group photograph and so on. And then they had a few days, and Bruno said, "I'm going to go down to San Giovanni and see what this Padre Pio fella is all about." Because some of the Capuchins, the jury was out with Padre Pio. They weren't sure of him, even though we can be very hard on each other. Look at your man, there he goes again, off again. And by the way, Kevin suffered a bit of that too, Oh, Crowley, yeah. Friends with presidents and archbishops and popes and everything like that, And he used to chuckle at that, actually, There's a bit of rivalry there, all right. But anyway, I'm going to go down, he said, and I'm going to see what this Padre Pio fella's all about. And he met Padre Pio, and they chatted in Latin. And there was, it was very clear that Padre Pio was very interested in the Irish church and the Irish missionaries, particularly Irish religious that went off to spread the gospel in foreign lands. And he said that he prayed for the Irish missionaries, and he also prayed every day for the Capuchin missionaries who went to the mission fields all over the place as well. And he had dinner with Padre Pio, and he recognized Padre Pio, like he had a good appetite, but he often he didn't eat a huge amount. He'd have a beer sometimes or a little wine with his meal, but he was never ever at the evening meal, only the midday meal. And the lads would be wondering where he was, and some of the lads who maybe hadn't seen him is Dolby Pugio. They used to call his pet name in the community was Pugio. Dolby Pugio. Where's Pio? He's upstairs receiving the guardian angels. And that was coming off the lips of friars as every day as, he's gone in to put the kettle on. He's gone in to butter the bread. And he would have traffic jams of angels into his room. Nobody else saw them, just him. And they would be whispering prayers for their spiritual children into the ears of Padre Pio, and Padre would be praying for them. Praise. And you can't, that just because Padre Pio is in heaven now and a saint, doesn't mean that he still can't do that. He does that. Send me your guardian angel, he always said. If you can't come to me, send me your guardian angel. So please do that. Send your angel to Padre Pio if you have a problem, if you have a prayer, and he won't let you down. Amen. So Padre Pio never turned up for the evening meal. And Bruno was, still kind of going, that's very interesting, because he didn't see anything miraculous when he was there. I even said to Bruno before he died, I said, he wasn't the tallest, but he was broad. He was about 5'8", about the same height as me. But he was agricultural, so he was tough. I wouldn't like to get a punch in the stomach from him, And in fact, he was someone who you wouldn't mess with. A bit like Brother Kevin. I wouldn't mess with Kevin. You wouldn't mess with Padre Pio. I remember one of the lads said, one of the young friars was helping out for the summer, and he started to laugh and say, "Ha ha, Padre Pio. So you say you see the angels?" "I'm sure you do." And Pio said, "Kid," he always called the young friars kid. "Kid, I see angels the way I see you." Can't deny that, can't you? How do you come back from that one? God bless you. So, the next morning, Bruno's finished his low mass. All the masses weren't celebrated that time. They were all individual masses at side altars. Padre Pio Padre was always up at 2:30. He started his mass at 5 o'clock. And Bruno had his mass said and was waiting and was giving his thanksgiving, and he was watching all these queues coming in, and he was wondering, look, the mass was over, Padre Pio was going off the altar, where are they all arriving in? He suddenly realised that there was communion. People were going to receive communion at the end of mass, and Padre Pio was coming out to take his turn to give communion with one or two of the other friars. He came out with his surplice on and his stole on, and they gave communion, reverently. The altar service would go along with the paten, and people would kneel and receive communion with their hands under the cloth. Yeah. He was going on, and people were queuing up to get into Padre Pio's line. Even though there was one or two others, they all went into Padre Pio's line. And Bruno was watching this with amusement, and he noticed this woman got out of the seat and made her way up, took her place in the queue, and there was sort of relays of people. The friars who were ushering would let a few people more onto the line and so on. And eventually she got to the top, she knelt, and Padre Pio came along with the altar server, and as she knelt in front of him and he gave her Holy Communion, she grabbed his hand and she kissed his gloved hand. Yeah. And he stopped. And all eyes that were on Padre Pio were now on her, and she knew it. And he said to her, "My daughter, you kissed the hand of the butler after you received the king." And Bruno heard this, and that's why he didn't tell it to me personally, he related it to me, but I remember he telling the story to a few of us. I'm sure he told it over the years. And Bruno said, "That's when I realised he was genuine. That's when I realised it was never about him. It's not about him. It's always about Jesus. It's always about Christ." And a friar who starts to, and this is the danger for me, for all of us, a friar who starts to believe in his own fame is in trouble. Because you run out of road very quickly, and you run out of energy, you run out of steam if you start doing it for yourself, for your own advancement. And for Padre Pio, it was never about him. That's why he was able to bear the stigmata for 50 years, because it was doing it for Jesus. And the miracles were all. He told a woman one time, he said, "I can't just turn this on and off," in a sense. She asked, her son had disappeared at the end of the war, and she was wondering where he was. And he kind of prayed for a moment. He said, "You will see your son soon." And another, he said, "Look, I can't see anything, only what I'm shown." So, his glancing into the spirit world was all by appointment, So it was never about Padre Pio, it was always about Jesus. And all the great saints would be the same. And I would dare to say that Brother Kevin, it was never about Kevin. It was never about, his fame, and he was famous. Kevin said, "I can't do this. I wouldn't be able to do this, only that I pray." Padre Pio, when the friars asked him, "Who is Padre Pio?" he said, "I am this. I am only a poor friar who prays." In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.